Today I'm going to take another stab at making some end grain coasters. I made these about 8 years ago, and this is the sort of project that never turns out the same, so it's always fresh when you make another one, and I felt like doing a fun scrapwood project. Drain coasters are quite small. This one is only about 3 1/4 by 3 1/4, so you make it up with a whole bunch of little pieces. So this is how you justify all those little scraps that you've been hoarding for years. Now, of course, this is way more than I'm going to need, but I've got some maple. This is some ash, I think. A tiny little bit of white oak, Osage orange, quite a lot of walnut, yellow heart, cherry, a little bit of bloodwood or padauk, and this is a random tabletop that I made. This is actually kind of fun. This is from a board that my father-in-law brought home from Kenya almost 20 years ago, and I've since taken apart that table, so I'm going to repurpose that. Now again, this is a sample of one I made 8 years ago, and the really key thing I learned back then is the importance of high contrast. You want to make sure you've got some dark wood. Here's a bit of walnut. This I think is some white oak, and here is some padauk, I think, interspersed with some cherry and such. You've got to have some wildly different colors of wood in order to make your coaster look extra interesting. Now, not to get too far ahead of the game, but one of the things I'm planning to do this time to mix things up is to have a solid wood border around the outside. So either cherry or walnut, some sort of a banding around the whole thing, and then the random arrangement in the middle. That's what I'm aiming for. Let's see how it goes. For my first glue up, I've picked 2 pieces of red heart, 2 pieces of maple. That should make for a really nice solid contrast. Yeah, this project is going to involve a lot of gluing, clamping, and waiting, and then doing it again. And of course, not all my scraps are smooth on both sides, so I am going to have to run some through the table saw to clean them up. So I'm going to use this cardboard box as a little visual aid right now. The idea is that we're gluing up all these little pieces together, and we're going to end up with a chunk of wood that's kind of like this, and then we're going to cut the coasters by slicing that piece. So the individual slices are going to be pretty skinny. So one of the things I can do is take short pieces and butt them up end for end as I'm gluing up these blanks, because when it's all said and done, I'll be cutting these little slices out of it, so the butt joint will either disappear or that'll be one scrap section out of the block. And in this way, you get the maximum efficient use of all your little scraps. And then once these are dry, we'll clean them up and start gluing these together. I let them dry overnight, and the next day I've got 3 chunks of wood, which I'm now going to take to the jointer and do some cleaning up. And then I promptly glued up some more blanks. This one happens to be 2 larger chunks of walnut, and then there's a couple of thin pieces of maple, and on this side I threw some yellow heart just for the contrast. So after putting all those little pieces together, I now have 4 blanks, I'll call them, 4 glued up chunks that I then want to now bring those together. And of course, there's no rhyme, no reason, no pattern to this. When you're working with little scrap wood, you're gonna end up with what you end up with. And again, the idea is just to mix and match different pieces of wood. And this piece caught my eye because I had put these together and I had planned to now square it up for gluing further, but as I was fiddling around with the pieces, I realized that I could take this one and I can interlock it there. So I'm coming up against this, and then maybe later tomorrow or later today, I'll take this piece and I think I can glue it on here, and then we're going to end up with one pretty big chunk. And it's almost entirely flush across the top, so it's going to require some creative clamping, because I don't want to end up with gaps later on. There's a lot of making it up as you go along with this sort of a project. Yeah, I need to get glue on this, but also on this. It's not often that you have to clamp in 2 directions, but you want nice tight joints, obviously, because you don't want cracks showing in your coasters. I think I need a little bit more in here. And in this glue up, I'm making sure that I've got glue squeeze out there showing a good joint, and then also glue squeeze out along there showing a good joint. And I'm still fingers crossed that is going to turn out. So as you can see, I've still got a whole bunch of scrap wood. So while I've been working on this one, I've also been actually gluing up another one off screen. I've got 3 blanks so far: maple and cherry with walnut, maple and Osage orange with walnut, and some more maple and Osage orange, and a little bit of white oak here. And I want to put all 3 of them together at the same time. And I've got my crosscut sled, but the important thing is it's got this right angle in here. So I'm going to put some wax paper in here, and then this hopefully will help me keep all 3 pieces nicely aligned to the bottom as I'm working on gluing it up. And I'll just glue it this way, and I won't have to worry so much about it slipping up and down like that. And in case it wasn't obvious, the wax paper keeps it from getting glued to the cross-cutting sled. I just thought I'd show that there's, you know, multiple ways that you can go about gluing these things together. I've been using the Lee Valley wood glue, which is a GF, a gap filler. I hadn't really even thought about that when I started, but having the gap filling might be something that's nice with a project like this. I'm just holding it down to make sure it stays hopefully nicely aligned along the bottom. I'll probably still have to run it over the joiner afterwards, but we'll see if this just gives us a head start in keeping things nicely aligned. I do want to make sure I'm scraping the glue out of here because I want the ability to glue something into that space later on. Haven't decided yet on what I might put there, but let's keep our options open. And after it's dried, let's take a look. Well, it's still a bit wet actually. The wax paper kept it from entirely drying, but more importantly, it is nice and flush, which is what I was hoping for. Might need to sit for a little bit longer to get that glue dry completely. So I'm getting ready to do the next glue up here, and just FYI, this is that piece of that tabletop from that board that my father-in-law brought back from Kenya. With the finish off, it's got this rich chocolatey brown, but still with some interesting color streaks. I have no idea what it is. He just showed up with a board in his suitcase one day. And that's the next glue up for that chunk. Now, before I move on to the next step with this chunk, let me pause a moment. I wouldn't normally do this, but I understand that not everybody can visualize the way I can. And so I can see how this is going to develop. But, you know, this is really a make it up as you go along process. So let me take a moment. I'm going to cut the end off on the bandsaw, and we can take a look at how things are progressing. And so with this piece cut off, we can now get a look at the end. So this is giving us a hint of what the random end grain coaster is going to look like. We got your large chunk of walnut here, and then this is maple. This is a bit of yellow heart. Here are the stripes of the alternating maple and cherry. Over here, there's the red heart and with some other maple. And I think this long skinny bit is some cherry. I'm not entirely sure off the top of my head. This gives you an idea of what we're going to end up with. And now we need to just glue on a few more chunks to bring this closer to the finished size. So I don't think this matters this much, but I've been calling this wood red heart, and it's actually not. I found the piece where I had the name written down, and it's actually bloodwood. They are often mistaken. They're both dark and red, but they're not the same. It doesn't really matter for the purposes of this project, but I just wanted to get that correction in there. So there were several rounds of gluing and clamping and waiting and so on and so forth, which I didn't film, but I now have 2 completed blanks, which are both about 3 inches by 3 inches. These are also still lumpy, so I still need to clean these up also. So my blanks are just a hair over 2 3/4 inches square. And the one is about 16 inches long. And the other one is about, oh, a little over 12 inches of usable stock. They're still not finished because, like I said way back when, I was going to try wrapping them. So I'm going to prepare some walnut now, and we're going to do some more gluing up. To wrap the outsides, I need larger pieces of wood, so I couldn't use my scraps. So I resawed some larger pieces of walnut down and then glued them into panels, which I then planed down to the thickness that I needed. I'm first going to glue on these two sides, and when that is set, then we will turn it 90 degrees and we'll glue some pieces on the other sides. Doing my best to keep these flush with the bottom. These are still slipping very easily. I was tempted to put some pin nails in the end, but maybe I should try that salt idea that some people talk about. For the other one, I went back to the crosscut sled with the wax paper to hopefully help it line up and stay flush along the bottom. We'll see when it dries. They both turned out pretty good, but I think I'm still going to run them over the joiner, taking a really light pass just to get them cleaned up before I move on. And of course, on this side, I have to take down the excess wood. Actually, a little block plane work first. I brought it close with the table saw, but I'm going to use a flush trim router bit to bring it the rest of the way to flushness. Okay, the first glue up should have gone simpler. I made it way too difficult trying to be precise because as I was thinking forward about what I was going to do, I wasn't thinking about the flush trim bit. I was just thinking about using the table saw and the joiner. That was silly. This next glue up's going to go a lot easier because I'm planning right from the beginning to be using a flush trim bit later, so I don't have to get everything perfect. It can wiggle a bit. I've made the boards a little bit extra wide. So I'm just going to position this so that there's a little overhang on both sides of it. And I'm going to let that set up while I start on this one. And now it's okay if they slip a little bit as long as they are overhanging the side. And now the same thing with this one. So you can glue squeeze out all the way along both sides. Hopefully a good solid glue joint. And then the next day I could flush trim those pieces. My bandsaw miter gauge is pretty rotten, so I borrowed the miter gauge from my table saw. It's a little bit better. Now let's clean up the end and see what we got. And here we finally get our first look at our finished blanks. Here's that beautiful random arrangement of end grain that I was looking for, and it's wrapped in this walnut border. This is going to make some beautiful coasters once I've got it, some finish on it. And they're different. You know, this piece has a lot more of the Osage orange in it, and this piece has got more of the bloodwood in it. They're both going to look amazing in their own way. So we've done all the prep work. We got our blank. We're now ready to actually slice some coasters out of it. And I like to make a pretty good sized blank so I can get several sets of coasters out of it. I'm only going to cut one set out of each of these, but this one especially, I've got a huge chunk of wood here. I don't know. I'm not even sure how many. I have not done the math. I like to have these tucked up on the shelf, and whenever I need a couple, I can just slice them out. I'm going to cut mine on the bandsaw. You could do this on the table saw, but with this thickness, you would have to make multiple cuts, and it might be a bit dicey to get it aligned. But I just put a brand new blade on there, and it's cutting like butter. And I like to cut mine sort of between 1/4 and 3/8 of an inch thick. I'm going to make my cuts nice and slow and easy. I don't want to push anything. So here I've laid them all out. I ended up cutting 7 of this one. I just wanted to have a spare one. And then I cut 8 of this one because I noticed there was a little hole there. As you cut your way through the blank, slicing off your coasters, you might find some flaws in the wood, which is what I did. This is one of the worst ones. You can see there is a crack here in the walnut. So that last chunk of walnut had a crack at the end of it. And the other part I notice here is that one of my glue ups failed, and there's a gap right here between this little thin strip and here. So let's hold it up to the light and that'll really make it obvious. So here, as I hold it up to the light, you can just see the light shining through there and here. And in actually fact, you can see there's a bit of a gap here too. For some of the flaws, there's just nothing you can do about it. And that's why we make a big blank so that we have extra. I've tried putting epoxy like in the crack and it does fill it, but because it's end grain, I find it really stains around it. So I don't really like that look. But for that little gap between two boards, I'm going to try filling that with some toothpicks. So I just have some little softwood toothpicks here, which I've chopped up with a chisel, and then I've wedged them in with some glue. And then here is one where I did this yesterday, and you can, I don't even know if you can see where I wedged in the toothpick. It's just going to look like another tiny little piece of wood in your coaster. And here's a close-up of that cut off end of the toothpick. You know, it's just another piece of end grained in the coaster. Yeah, the walnut darkens up so much. It's going to look cool with that border. This is all end grain, so it really goes rough after the first coat of a water-based finish, but we will sand it down with 220 and move on to 2 or 3 or 4 more coats. Just a few seconds with 220. It does not take much to knock off the high spots. So off screen, I went back to that pile of scrap wood that I'd started with, and there was a whole bunch of little walnut strips left. So I glued up a bunch of them to make panels, and I resawed and planed them down to make some walnut for making storage boxes, because I like to make storage boxes for my coasters. I like to orient them vertically. I think that works well. These strips are just about 3/8 of an inch thick, which is plenty for a little box like this. And I'm going to rip them down to about 2.5, I think. Hang on. I'm going to rip them down to 2 3/8. Yeah. And I'll set up a stop here on my crosscut jig and use the actual coasters and then the actual bits of walnut to figure out how long I need to make the sides. And I do want a little bit of wiggle room, so we'll just sort of space over a 1/16 or so. And then that is how long we will cut our side pieces. I next set a stop block on my crosscut sled here, took some test cuts, and then used that to make rabbets on the edges of those pieces. And then I just needed to cut the ends to length. For the bottoms, I like to use plywood for stability, and it gives a little bit of color contrast. It's quite thin, only about 1/4 of an inch thick. And again, on my crosscut sled, I set up a stop block and I run it all the way around, making a little dado. that it sits in, so that locks the bottom into place, and it lifts the box off the table a little bit, makes a little shadow line around the bottom. Just a little bit of glue in here, and hopefully no squeeze out. Putting the bottom in at the same time helps lock it square. Yeah, I ended up adding a lot more clamps. They're not on there tight. It was just to help with alignment and such, and I may have gone a bit overboard. We'll get them a quick bit of sanding, and then we can get finish on these as well. Ooh, that ain't right. That is not right. I noticed these gaps in the joints, and I investigated, and it turns out that one of my boxes was cockeyed, so I ended up having to make a new one quickly. We're just going to skip over that. Sometimes things like that happen. But we will be extra careful checking for square on this one. And I'm putting the same kind of finish on the boxes that I put on the coasters, which is a water-based polyurethane. You can tell that it's made up of a bunch of little strips, but I think that just looks kind of nice. And here at last we have our end results. I've put 4 coats of poly on the coasters, and I put 3 coats on the boxes. The boxes are sized to hold 6 coasters, and they're designed with just a little bit of wiggle room both side to side and front to back, so that they are not inclined to get stuck when you're just sticking one in or pulling one out. So here's the raw wood blanks that we worked so hard to make to compare what the finished color looks like. I've arranged them so they're just exactly the same. So, you know, there's that large piece of walnut, and there's the large piece of walnut. Here's those stripes, and there's the bloodwood. So you can just see how the finish affects the coloration of these two. And of course, the Osage orange, like some of these are going to darken with time depending on UV exposure. Just comparing these new coasters, here's some other ones that I've made over the years. These are from about 8 years ago, end grain coasters, some side grain coasters, hexagon side grain coasters, an extra long coaster. This comes off my desk. These were by far the most amount of work. I mean, out of all of these, the side grain coasters are the easiest because, you know, you just glue up some boards, so there's only one gluing operation, run it through the planer a few times, and then cut it to size. You're done. Same with this one. The hexagon is just a little bit more work. Again, glue it up, plane it to size, and then you have to make the hexagon cuts. These other end grain coasters should have been just as much work as this, and maybe it's just my faulty memory, but it just felt like these were more work. I think part of it is that I really worked to make these even more random with a whole lot more glue ups, and just adding the walnut around the outsides added a whole nother step of precision woodworking that had to be done. I hope that doesn't come across like I'm trying to scare you off. I think these are gorgeous. I'm really happy with how they turned out. I especially really like that dark walnut border. Just recognizing it was a fair bit of effort to get here. And I think that about wraps up this project. Thank you very much for stopping by. I hope you found something interesting that you can use in your own shop, and we'll see you next time.